Hello and welcome to another Lord of the Rings Rise to War video. I am the player who plays as the King Under the Mountain, and today I'm going to do another one of these commander guides and sort of talk about people who are in the meta or around the meta after the update in September. People are kind of calling this now Lord of the Rings 2.5, I guess, is probably where they're at, but I don't know. I still think it's kind of very much the same game. Do I think it's opened up some new options? Definitely so. But today we are going to look at the sort of like the king of all the Nazgul, I guess, really, the Witch King. We're going to look at a couple of builds for him. We're going to look at what he's like at R4. We're going to look at what he's like at Respect 10. We're going to look at what he's like in the Zenith levels as well, I think, which is probably where he truly shines. We're going to talk a little bit about RP. We're going to talk a little bit about NRP. We're going to talk about his interaction with other commanders, which I think is quite important, to be perfectly honest. We'll probably go through some gear options. We'll go through his unique. And from there, at that point, that will probably be about it. So, first of all, let's talk through the skills. And the first thing we're going to talk through is... Let's go for the bottom R0. So, he has in his kit Black Captain, which is probably one of the best troop damage skills that you could probably get in this game. I would say there's not many more, and that is for the first 2 rounds. Orc, Uruk-hai, and Trolls in units in 3 allied formations have a 75% chance to deal dual blows. Now, at level 5, that damage stat of units in 3 formations plus 5% for 10 rounds, and at level 10 it affects 4 formations. So at level 10 is probably where you're going to see the most out of it from a troop support point of view. We'll go into the troop build later on because I think there's a couple of interesting nuances, shall we say, around different things which he can probably help you with. But first of all, we'll go into the other skills and then probably look at builds straight after. So, Lord of the Nazgul is his other Respect 0 skill, I guess, as it's now known. And that deals 320% focus damage once to a formation every couple of rounds when it's maxed out. Level 5 is quite interesting. It's 50% chance to inflict stun on the target after the target receives the damage lasting for 1 round, which is pretty good. And in addition, target's defense minus 10 for 1 round, which, to be fair, depending on what's in your formation, that's either useful or not overly useful, but you kind of don't really need to max that one out, I would hazard a guess, really and truthfully, if you're playing that way, but you're likely to do that if you're playing through his damage tree. So. Here's Respect 2 skill as it now is. I keep calling it 3 like the old days, but his Respect 2 as it is now is Nazgul, and I really like this as a skill. It's probably one of my favourite skills because it bypasses all sorts of evasion and White Council and things like that because it's set pre-battle. So, caveat to White Council, it will avoid White Council if you are faster than a Gandalf, for example. But it does avoid evasion, so it's a pretty cool skill, to be fair. So for the first 2 rounds, deals 400% focus damage, which is a pretty big bomb, to be honest, to 2 enemy formations upon taking action at the start of each round. And this is what I mean about it's set pre-battle, so it's kind of a debuff to them as opposed to as opposed to attack to you, I suppose. So at level 5, this also then deals 200% poison damage after this effect ends, which is pretty cool. And then for the first 2 rounds, there's a 30% chance to inflict stun on the target. So, as you're already looking from Witch King's kit, you've already got a few stuns in there, which, to be honest, are very useful. It's a very stun-heavy sort of look at the top end of the meta now. So, he definitely fits in that regard for the sake of the stuns. Then one of his most interesting trees, and we'll come on to this later on when we talk about formations, I suppose, because it nestles quite well with Sauron. And that is a Lord of Minas Morgul. Now, at max, because that's not quite max, it's attack, focus, and defense of 2 enemy commanders at minus 20 for 5 rounds, effect modified by command stat. Now, I like this as a skill because it does modify okay, and it does help with the debuff on other commanders. It is only 2 enemy commanders, so you've kind of got to hope that he's hitting the right people, to be honest. Also got to make sure he's quicker than pretty much everyone else to make sure that debuff hits before they start putting their own skills in. Which, to be honest, Witch King's base initiative is pretty high anyway, so it's likely that you'll get around to that. You'll struggle, but you probably will be quicker than a Scal if you're sort of run agility sets and things like that these days as well, which would be useful. Then at level 5, when the commander's formation is comprised of large units, it gains madness immunity, which is pretty good in the current meta. There's lots of madness and stun around. And then at level 10, and I've got to be honest, I'm inclined to look at these two things slightly differently. But at level 10, when the commander's formation is comprised of large units, it gains stun immunity. Now, stun immunity is pretty useful, to be perfectly honest. But realistically, whichever way you build your Witch King, apart from debatably through Black Captain, that stun immunity is probably not as important as what it could be. Nazgul happens anyway, and your Lord of the Nazgul is a pretty decent focus skill at R4, but until you've got that maxed out, and then the likelihood is you'd be respect 10 anyway and you'd fill all 3 of these trees, you probably don't need it. So if I was building a respect 4 version of Witch King, this is what I'd do, and I would just bank on not needing that stun immunity, mainly because the Nazgul skill will go off anyway, which is kind of what you're going to use him for early damage in this setup. So that's kind of where I'd be at respect 4. If I was respect 10 and I was running through if I was playing respect 10 and let's go for it, why not? And I was playing through trying to get him to do some damage, I would run him like that. Now, if I was going for troop support, I'd do it slightly different, but we'll go through damage first of all and how his kit doesn't quite always line up, which is really frustrating. So, for me, he is a very good support commander who does some damage, which is sort of how I see Undying as well, but I'll come on to that a different day. But this skill here with this debuff is really powerful when it's mixed with Sauron. So we'll just go into, if I was running his damage build, for example, I would probably run him with something like this, with this chest plate kind of maxed out, with some agility to make sure he was still quick, because you really do need him to be quicker than Gandalf the White. I don't know where Gandalf the White is on here, actually. He's up here somewhere. So my Gandalf the White's 43, plus I'll get 10 for initiative, so 53 without troops. You're likely to run a large unit on him, so he's going to be slow with troops, so you need him to be above that 53, which he is, plus a little bit of initiative. He's still going to be faster than your Gandalf at that point. And that's kind of quite important. So for me, the call, to be fair, if you're going to use the Witch King in a kind of damage build, or even, to be honest, in his troop support build, is probably your best in slot headpiece. The rest you can argue and play around with, mainly because you're getting command and focus and a little bit of unit defense and unit attack if you're running him in if you're in the troop build. But realistically, you also want that initiative to make sure you've got the chance to debuff people like a Scalhelm. You'll debuff a Dane anyway, if I'm being honest, but people like a Scal, a Gandalf the White, you would potentially hit Sauron before they hit you, which again would lower the sort of effects of the enemy, which is quite useful. Witch King, I think, now is a really interesting commander, and I do think he has a place somewhere in the meta. I think he's quite hard to find that place. The chess piece in particular, you're probably looking at purely a focus set for this to make sure his focus is boosted up, but that's not unreasonable as a set. He's still got 300 command, so he'll do a little bit of tanking. If I was running him purely for damage, which I personally wouldn't, that is what I would do. So the likelihood is, what I would probably do if I was using Witch King, is that I would try and get him to do some tanking and some damage. And this is what I mean by his kit doesn't quite line up properly. If this, for example, scaled off focus, I think it'd be a very, very uniquely built piece of kit to run him as a kind of support damage dealer. It doesn't. So for me, you've kind of got to run him as a tank with a little bit of damage. He has got some support elements in there. Like I say, he is debuffing, and he has got a lot of stun chances in all these skills and things like that, and he is stun and madness immune, which is nice. He's actually got a really nice base damage as well, but I don't think you can quite get that from him. So if I was running him how I would probably run him, I would change out this, for example, for something like that. So I've got some decent command, and then I would probably keep the weapon so I've still got some damage. So his damage is lower, but you've still got okay focus. You've got a lot of troop defense. And you've got quite high command in there. If you wanted to go full command and go for full debuff and move in full tank, which is slightly different, but you could potentially take away this piece and stick in a Noldor sword, which then you're not getting the maximum from your damage output because your damage has just dropped dramatically. But you've now got 635 command, okay-ish focus stat by the time you've upgraded that. And he will tank really nicely for you at this point and still do a small amount of damage. But that's why I think he's very hard at the moment to skill in the meta. And I think it needs some testing, to be honest. I'm literally just talking through as many options as I can. Obviously, that 635 command will really affect this here. And it could be a game changer to a degree. You know, that's a big debuff. Hitting the right two comms is really effective. With this, he's still pretty quick as well. I do think agility is one of the better sets on him. If you're running him purely as a tank, I think you still need half an agility to set at least, and at least one agility piece to make sure you're maximising his abilities as best you can. So that's kind of talking through a few builds, really. I suppose he's got a damage build, which is what I talked through originally. He will put out some okay damage. It's, you know, not massive damage, but it's okay damage. I've talked through there the fact that you can run him as a full tank because he has got a decent base command set. And then the other one is you could run him as a troop support commander, which we don't see a lot of in the game at the moment. But if I was going to be doing that, I think this is where it becomes quite hard to do again because you're going to lose something from his kit at R4. Now, I think it changes dramatically when you're at Zenith levels, and particularly sort of like a Zenith 8, to be perfectly honest. I think a Zenith 8 Witch King, which there are some knocking around that people don't use, is actually a really powerful tool because you would be able to fill Black Captain, for example. You'd be able to have 5 points in Lord of the Nazgul. You'd be able to fill this tree and fill this tree. And all of a sudden you've got someone who is stun immune, madness immune if he's using large units, which if you're using him as a bit of a tank, he will be. You've got some nice damage, you've got some stuns, so you're doing a lot of support work. And if you're maxing out this tree, these dual blows, particularly in, say, a formation where you could be working with, and this is a little bit rogue, but something like a Mouth of Sauron, Witch King, and let's go for Saruman, for example. The amount of debuffing that you're doing to your opponent in that, while also trying to get your troops to sort of double up so they'll get through some White Council or some evade. They'll still hit through evade because there's so much more stuff going on. Across all four formations with evil units, their physical damage has been completely debuffed by a load of different skills in that formation, for example. I didn't really want to go into this now, but I will kind of talk for it a little bit. So, but you're using purely focus or burn damage, and from that point you can probably get that to work. And it's quite an interesting theory, one that I'm going to test when I get back in season and see how that works. So if I was going, and this is where I think it's difficult to do, if I was going to run something like a Respect 4 troop build, for example, unfortunately I don't think Black Captain's good enough unless it's completely full to be used as a skill. I would argue that I would probably still like this, and I would probably get this to, I'd ideally like that at 5. So I would be running, because if we're going to use him as a troop support, he's likely to be doing some tanking. I'd have to get a large unit in there, but then again, it's going to be a troll with double attack, which isn't exactly ideal, to be perfectly truthful. And I would probably run him something like that at Respect 4. There would be an argument that you'd go 9 points in here and 5 in there, I guess, and just take away the sort of madness immune. Would probably be another way of doing it. So you could go, again, your 10 points in here, just spending gems for fun here. You could go 5 in here, 4 in here, 5, and you would probably go 5 in here, and I would go 9 in here. I've just gone to 10, but I'd go 9 in there. And then you've still got that extra little bit of damage. You lose the stuns, granted, but you're still getting your stun and madness immunity from this. The School of Thought as well, you could go 10 and 4 and just accept the fact that you're not getting any of the madness immunity and take the stuns, which again is another viable option. Worth playing around with. I'm just saying he is actually quite a flexible commander. If I was running him for that sort of troop support build, I would still, to be honest, be looking at tanking to a degree. So I'd be doing something like that, I think, realistically. And I would be using him with trolls and using other people with some burn damage and some sort of Morgul Arbalest maybe for some poison damage. And then effectively trying to debuff my opponent so far and using him as a tank with some really good unit defense. If I was running him that way, which I don't think, unless I'm Zen of 8, I'm probably likely to run him that way, but I think it's an interesting combination. If you're a Zen of 8 Witch King, I think he's got real potential to actually be in the meta, and that's the full sort of meta, but again, it needs testing, but I think he's got a lot of possibilities at that sort of level to do a lot of flexibility with his kit. I hope that makes sense about his kit. By the way, there's a lot of different builds of him, and that's why I think it's nice, because it's allowing us to sort of play around with things, and different formations will bring out different parts of the Witch King's kit. As for his relic itself, it's okay. It's a little bit meh. The stats are nice, as they always are with these things. It also looks a little bit weird to me, but anyway, kind of looks like he's just got a sharp point on the end of his arm, but I know it's supposed to be reins. As for all these, unless it's fully refined, I can't see how you can make it all work together. This is saying you need attack, which realistically, I don't think you're going to be building your Witch King for attack to get this instance of damage dealt just for that. And his initiative's always going to be 60, so the chance of him receiving dual blows is nice, and that does scale quite nicely as well. But unless it's a real full refine and you're thinking of it's like a Z8 Witch King, I think you just take the unique for the stats and don't really do a great deal with it. So now we've kind of talked through gear. If you're going, like, say, down the troop support build, I think you use him as a support com, and you run him with defense gear and some sort of troll unit just to help the rest of your team, while the rest are putting out some damage, I would say. As for formations, I know I've kind of touched on it there. Let's go roleplay first. So for me, in a roleplay formation, I think he's very viable. I think he's got some good kit which takes down a lot of the good side meta. You know, if you're hitting your Danes and your Bjorns and your Gandalf the Whites, for example, so that's 3 of the 4 general formation that you'll see with Gil. His R5 is very useful. The one thing I will say about the R5, and this is why I quite like Falcon, it's the same reason as for countering a Sauron, for example. Now, Falcon's R5 Thrane's Guard, which is very much a dwarf version of White Council, is affected by command. Now, Sauron and in fact, Mouth of Sauron the same. So Sauron, Mouth of Sauron, for example, and the Witch King do not debuff command. So your potential, you can still run Falcon slow, for example, and still get the maximum from Thrane's Guard, which can be 60-70% reduction. Whereas with White Council, the likelihood is you're going to get slightly reduced by a Witch King anyway if you get hit with this formation, because he will be faster and he will reduce your focus stat before your White Council comes out. I hope that makes sense. So in an in a roleplay meta, I do think the Witch King is a viable person alongside Sauron. If I was maybe trying to run something like that, I would be running Saruman. I'd probably genuinely run Saruman, Witch King, Sauron, and Shadow would probably be what I would run in the evil side RP to fight the good side RP with trolls, and probably try and counter bow knights with the damage would probably be the way I'd look at it. Slight bit of water. In NRP, I do think he's got a place in the meta, but I think he's got to be more. He's probably in most people's B teams, if I'm being honest, and probably high respect to make him part of that meta, or at least more so in the meta. I mean, you can get some good troop damage out of him, and also some good damage from himself. I mean, I know some high zen of Witch Kings that are getting over 100k damage running those sort of hybrid builds, but the problem is, yet again, his kit isn't quite refined enough to say that it's one or the other, so you're always taking away from one half of his kit to give something to the other part of his kit, which is probably a frustration, if I'm being honest. But I could see him working in a NRP team of something like a Dane, Sauron, Witch King, and Shadow, to be honest, or a Saruman, just so you've got a little bit of balance and everything. I still think Dane will be in there because he is literally still the king of the damage dealers for me. But there is that interesting interaction between Witch King and Sauron, whereby the amount of debuff that they're putting on the enemy, if they're fast enough with this thing here. So he's affecting 3 commanders, which is slightly better, and then it's 4 commanders at level 10. So if your Witch King and your Sauron is faster than, say, a Gandalf the White, which it should probably be these days in the new meta, I would say, your potential to debuff their White Council, which could be anything up to 70%, down by a real reduction to sort of 40-50%, maybe even a little bit lower, to be honest. Your potential to do that's very high. And realistically, with the way people are building Gandalf the White now, because of running Gil a lot more, people are going for high focus on Gandalf the White and not a lot of troop defense, for the simple reason that they think they can get more damage out of him, and they think that because of Gil's evade, you can extend White Council into rounds 4 or 5, so Gandalf doesn't need to tank so much for you. So the unit defense Gandalf, which is kind of how I build mine, I'll just try and show you now. So I kind of build a little bit of a hybrid Gandalf. So in this new sort of meta and system that people are testing now, this is kind of a thing of the past, and people are looking at sort of 270 focus because they're working with Gil to sort of extend White Council by using the Elf Evade. So if you've got sort of 270 focus and 70%-ish White Council, and you run into this reduction from Sauron and Witch King together, for example, your whole kit was revolving around that White Council being fantastic. So you basically made a paper by the time they actually get through to your formation. So if you've got a Witch King that's doing some follow-up and some Nazgul damage, so you're already doing some damage to the formation, whether there's an evade there or not, I just think there's some potential there for that combination in particular to work. And then with these the new Gandalfs, where they're sort of the 270 focus, you've debuffed them so heavily that actually their damage isn't great because the focus stat's quite low, and their White Council was low enough that he's still causing quite a lot of damage. I just think there's a lot of potential for those two. I hope that makes sense as a combination against the new meta. Although the so-called new meta, I'm not actually so sure the jury's out for me on the new meta, but there you go. It's the same with Dane, really. So say if you've got a really high attack Dane, which most of them will be these days, I would say. So let's throw what I put on Dane. People are kind of looking at around 250 attack for Dane at sort of the top end. Maybe a little bit more, maybe 270 if they want to overkill it. I've put the wrong headset on here. Never mind, we'll do that. So that's my Dane, and that's how he'll look in season. But say I'm looking at 241 attack plus a 10 from this, it's 250 plus 10 from the ring, I'm at 260. Sauron and Witch King hit me together, let alone just Witch King alone. All of a sudden this attack's really low and I've got no way of getting it back up, and my Dane's not doing anywhere near as much damage in the fight. Now, Witch King is very much RNG in that respect, but again, he is potentially very good at debuffing these commanders quite far, and as I've kind of spoken about before, I would really be interested to see a Mouth of Sauron, Witch King, Sauron, and something like a Saruman, now that he's got the new skill in there, just to see what kind of potential that was. Because if you think of the two debuffs you've already got, plus then you're adding in the debuff from Mouth of Sauron, from something like this for the normal attacks, which is minus 50%. Plus then you've got this first 2 rounds attack free formations on both sides, minus 25, which won't matter to you because you're running focus damage. This then goes into 3 rounds. All of a sudden, there's a lot of debuff on your enemy, and you've got potential to do a lot of damage to them afterwards because you've got a lot of troops still alive and things like that. So that's quite an interesting formation. If I was going to run some sort of troop build, which again, it's hard. So if I was going to pick out 4 commanders from a roleplay side, for example, for that sort of troop build set, I would still have some damage in there. I still think you would have a Sauron, a Saruman, and I think you'd go Witch King and probably one more, maybe an Azrakor, I would guess, is probably the other person I'd put in, and try and do some damage that way. Obviously, Gothmog massively boosts troops, but I haven't seen enough from Gothmog yet to actually be able to sort of pull that through. You could get your Witch King to be full damage. So in that formation, you could have follow-up from Black Captain, for example, but also then have troops which are not tanky but there to cause damage, while something like so if you didn't have a Gothmog in there and you didn't have an Azrakor in there, which I think you would, you could maybe put Mouth Sauron in there and go for Mouth Sauron tank, Witch King damage and Saruman damage, and see what come out, and do it as a hybrid troop and damage build, which really could be quite interesting. I'd like to see some testing around that in the future. And I do plan to do some on that in the next season, which hopefully I'll be into fairly soon. The obvious sort of alluded to problem with this is I've missed out a Shadow. So again, you could go down a different formation. This is what I quite like now. There is a lot of different options. You could run Shadow and Saruman, which together probably aren't exactly ideal, because if you run into a Gil, both their kits are slightly diminished, but you will get through some White Council faster. So it's, as they say, swings and roundabouts. But if you're running something like a Saruman, Shadow, Witch King and Sauron formation, for example, again, that would probably work quite nicely as a sort of niche build where you could put some troop damage in there and tank with Witch King and Sauron while also getting your damage out of Saruman and Shadow. So I think, again, as a commander, he's very versatile. I do think he's in the meta. He's not top of the meta, but I do think he is in the meta just because of his versatility more than anything else. And sort of the rise of the Nazgul skill in particular, to counter these sort of Gil formations that we're seeing a lot of now, and to get through some really heavy White Councils, because White Council doesn't normally affect it because your initiative's higher and you've gone before Gandalf's. I do think he's in there, and I think he can do a good job for people. And with that, that was pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in regards to Witch King. I hope you found that interesting, because there's a lot of info in there that is around different formations. And I'm very much a believer in the minute at trying to find different formations to sort of help in regards to the meta and change the top commanders list on servers looking like there's just 50 of the same 4 commanders on there. So if in doubt, always follow your nose.